Hey guys, what's up? This is Freenochos for RunNetBalls.com. In this video, we're going to go over single raise flop in position pre-flop Brexit defending versus check raise. And what we're going to be doing is I'm going to show you guys the equilibrium baseline. We're going to present you guys some data. We're going to do some strategy development. We're going to go over some common mistakes. And then we'll do some deliberate drilling where I'm just going through GTO Wizard and try to learn as much as we can from the mistakes that we're going to be making. All right, so here we can see the average folding, calling, and raising frequencies, basing a check raise. So we get check raised, and then how often do we raise, call, or fold? And we can see that specifically on low textures, we end up doing a lot of calling and raising. And then on ace high textures, more folding. And then on mono textures, we're not doing an awful lot of raising at all. And this is very common for mono textures where you typically got to play very passive and just gotta make sure that you have essentially flushes on all sorts of lines so that you don't end up in a situation where you have 0 flushes and your opponent still has flushes. Because on mono textures, both players obviously are going to have a ton of very strong hands. You don't want to make it too easy for villain to polarize versus you. All right, so nice. In general, the pool slightly under check raises versus our c-bets. I wouldn't take this to the bank. This is just a slight trend. This used to be more pronounced, but these days I would expect most players to just play a relatively solid flop game versus a flop c-bet in one of the most common nodes like this. So yeah, definitely sort of assume that you're getting more or less an equilibrium check raise. There's going to be some specific textures, like for instance the monotone texture, where you need to play very passively, but your very strong hands, that is a bit more unintuitive, less intuitive. And so if you're playing in lower stakes environments or like even mid stakes, and you get check raised and then a bet on the turn, you can just assume that people put too much of their flushes in those lines. Same thing goes for pair textures to some extent. So there's definitely different textures where people might be imbalanced, but the grand scheme of things, I think people will be finding more or less a reasonable amount of check raises. After check raising, and then we call, they barrel the turn too often. And this is relatively important simply because of the fact that we are going to under-realize with specific hands. So imagine we have some 2 overcards plus a backdoor straight draw plus backdoor flush draw type hand, or even just like a single overcard and a backdoor flush draw. Like that hand class that is basically floating the flop. Those hands are going to do significantly worse the more the pool barrels, or the more your opponent barrels. Because a lot of the EV that we get for calling the flop with those hands doesn't necessarily come from hitting the backdoor, because it doesn't really happen very often. It comes from villain check raising the flop and then checking the turn, and then we get to either bet or we get to realize some additional equity. So yeah, that's definitely something to take into consideration. The moment that your opponent barrels the turn more often, we need to be more careful and we need to fold some of the closer indifferent hands. Having said that, the moment that he checks the turn, he's going to overfold versus stabs, as you can see here. Not a massive overfold, but there's a slight under-raise as well. If you plug this into a solver, the solver would very quickly go and range bet as the in-position player as an exploit, which I think is a fairly reasonable exploit for this worth in the vast majority of cases. Obviously not if you're playing a very competitive environment, like 3-handed 10-20 on stars or something like that with some of the top racks. Okay, maybe we don't that range, right? But in the vast majority of cases, you guys are not going to be playing 3-handed, playing 10-20 on stars. And so you probably can and should exploit by just betting range here. It's already like a node where you are allowed to bet at a reasonably high frequency facing a check. The small sizing is the most common sizing there. So should you get into this node, just betting at a very high frequency kind of makes sense. And doesn't mean that checking necessarily is a mistake, obviously. All right, so we're going to do some deliberate drilling in just a sec. And what we'll do is we'll load up 4 tables of GTO Wizard where we face a check raise. And then we're just going to drill through 100 hands with a time bank. And after the session, we're going to identify our mistakes, try to build context around those mistakes, right? So we're going to change the position, sizing, texture, hand strength, so that we can basically find some generalization that we can make that is going to be true in that spot. So for instance, like we are on a 10-high texture, we, like I said, 10-7 deuce, and we folded the hand that should be calling, let's say some king jack without a backdoor, king jack with a bit of backdoor. And we can say, okay, well, this is the case on all 10-high disconnected textures. So let's say it's 10-6 deuce, is it still the case? 10-8 deuce, is it still the case? What if it's a rainbow instead of a two-tone texture? What if it's a tighter formation? Are we still defending them? What if we change the sizing slightly? So basically what you're doing is play around with the data points so that you can build a better picture of the spot. Because sometimes what you see is like, okay, generally your hand plans is defending, but just this particular situation is slightly different, and now you're losing 0.04 big blinds and it's pure folding. It might be like, okay, well then we need to fold that spot. You can also just approach it from a more practical stance where you're saying, okay, well, typically this is defense. This one situation is an anomaly because I've just changed the positions and everything a little bit, then suddenly it becomes a defense. And so I'm just going to assume that it's a defense for now and just move on, because like realistically, no one is ever playing correct check raising frequency. The moment that you play that note, already we know for sure that you're not playing the range that solver has and villain's not playing the range that the solver has. That we know with a near certainty. So like if it's relatively close and you can't find an actual mistake where you're going and changing some data points and you realize, okay, well, actually it's like we just defend on like the disconnected textures, but this is too connected. And if I make it disconnected again, we call. And if I change the high card a little bit, but make it disconnected, we call. And if I make it too connected, we fold again. Then we can just say, okay, well, this is a fold. We only call the disconnected ones. But if we don't have something like that, then we need to just take a more practical stance, in my opinion. There's going to be some highly skilled GTO players that are now cringing a little bit, but that's basically the way I play. And I prefer to take a situation where I'm right 90% of the times, and I just assume that I'm right 100% of the times, rather than try to go into the nitty-gritty of every single defending spots. Especially if you have some incentives, which we'll go over like throughout the course. There are going to be many spots where we're basically saying, okay, it makes sense to over-defend here slightly, so it doesn't really matter if we just defend the pure folds that's losing 0.04 big blinds. Probably not. In this case, there's not really incentive, because there's an incentive to over-defend when it comes to like when villain checks, but when villain barrels the turn too often, we actually need to overfold a little bit. So it's kind of weird. Like basically the thing that we want to do, like there are two things. Like typically people end up overfolding a low disconnected boards. Like the defending threshold can be a bit tricky, and people end up check raising too often, especially if there's like a bunch of gutters on there. That's one. And then two, we should probably lean in general, right? Not on these textures, in general, lean towards over-defending hands that can call down, especially in wider formations. And what I mean by that is, if you have some situation where you have a hand, like basically you want to look more towards raw equity. Sometimes you have a situation where on 10-7, 10-7-4, or 10-7, let's say 10-7 deuce, pocket threes has more equity than queen jack with a backdoor. So two overcards and a backdoor flush draw. But the solver is just calling both of them at some frequency, right? Let's just assume that's true for now. Simply because the pool is barreling too often, you slightly prefer calling the hand that has more equity rather than has the backdoor capabilities, because you're not going to get into this check line, which that backdoor hand kind of favors. Right, so nice. We'll load up 4 tables in GTO Wizard, and then we're just going to drill through 100 spots and try to identify our mistakes. Alright, so here we are at 4 tables. We're just going to click through some hands and then review them. This is close. Yeah. Yep, yeah. It's actually a false. I'm leaning generate towards over-defending a bit, which... yeah, there's some reason to, but probably not too warranted. This is probably going to fold quite often from dumb scrolling. So we'll just ace 9 on a pre-connected texture. It's a low texture, so I'm going to call, but relatively close. Oh, I folded the gutter there. It was a mistake. It's actually just a misclick. So we 5-out pairs should defend quite often. Not always, but quite often. Back to straight up plus back to flush. Like Jack 8 definitely defending. It is a bit closer of click call, but it might be a mistake. Yeah. And that King Queen high, which is defense. This is definitely a defense. It was close. Wow, I'm surprised by that. It seems like a fold. Ace King is probably close, but yeah, we're just going to defend. Here in different low frequency call, I think, but it's actually pure folding. That's cool. Browse it. Go on. Don't have any deal with Coca-Cola, by the way. Yeah, okay. Turn high, back to straight or back to flush. So I thought that would be a call. I'm just going to call this, but it's close. These paired ones are sort of unintuitive. Usually to defend these on paired textures. So pairs and paired textures are relatively strong because you don't have that many pairs. Yeah, like it was Jack 10, I think I fold more there, but wasn't too sure about King Jack. So 2 off guard plus back to straight or I'm back to flush. So I think I'm going to call, but pretty close. King Jack. Pair plus gutter, I think we just defend. We top pair. Kind of want to fold this, to be honest, but gutter. Can we fold all gutters? Probably not. That's obviously one of the better gutters. 32 street, which is pretty cool. This seems disconnected, not want to call this at some frequency. Ooh, there goes a streak. Jinx it. Gutter plus 2 overcards, I think we call. Just 2 overcards. Messing up a little bit now. King 5. I think it's more like 6-5 that we defend, but 5-out pairs we rarely fold. Pocket 3s is close. Yeah, okay, that's pretty cool. So on the pair textures, we typically defend pairs. On ace king, it's a bit like we have so many aces that we might need to fold this, but I'm just going to go with my general heuristic. Ace 6 is close than folding, I think. With the spades. With the spades. Okay. So not a great session. Also not my worst. So let's go here and show hands. We're just going to go over the EV list actually. So I ended up clicking call here. One thing that I want to check here, so I want to change the texture a little bit. So let's say it's rainbow, and then we still fold. Okay, so this would be an upgrade. I'm just going to open up Anki, and let's say we do something like this, and then we start calling. So like basically I'm over defending right now with hands like this, and it makes sense to defend versus check raise. So basically what we're doing in situations like this is we identify the mistake. Is this really a mistake? Yes, it is, because even if I change it a bit to where I suspect it to call more, which it does, right? But then still it's pure folding pretty much. So a couple of things that we'd need to check here. So let's go here again. We want to have the spade. If we don't have the spade, then we don't want to have a heart, right? That's like a reasonable way to go about it. The ones with a heart are losing less than the other ones. And if we do the same thing for ace king, ones without a heart are losing less than the other ones. So that makes sense, because we want villain to have king queen of hearts or king 10 of hearts or something like that here. So we are going to say fold. Okay. Like, this could be distilled further to something better, but when I'm doing this kind of work, I'm not trying to win an Olympic medal of like finding the exact perfect heuristic. And it will happen from time to time that I'm drilling through a specific deck of cards, which I always do before my sessions. And then I have a card and I'm like, well, that doesn't feel as precise as it could be. And then I just change it. I just go into the sim again. So yeah, that's basically my approach. You could also just go pretty deep and just try to find the most pure heuristic there. But yeah. So I folded here. I kind of want to see, okay, like let's say we are, so like ace x is always calling here. So I want to play around with this. Are there any situations in which we do fold that? Yeah, so but even in these spots, you're mostly calling. So I'm just going to say, wait, there's actually a top pair that I folded that was correct, I think. So I kind of want to see which one that was. So ace. I feel like I did fold the top pair. Maybe I'm making stuff up. So I folded an ace 2 times. Is this a fold or did I call here? Let's see. I ended up folding here, but the top pair that should be called. Is that correct? Yeah, so I'm just mistake. So what we're going to do, again, this is pretty cool because now we can see the trend. I made 2 mistakes here with like folding top pair. I remember like making some mistakes earlier when I initially made this video. This is basically I recorded this video before, but then I recorded it in the wrong settings, so it was useless. But in that video, I was over calling a bit, so I remember that, and then now I'm leaning towards overfolding with hands that actually should be calling. So here, So this is like probably close enough. And then we killed 2 birds with 1 stone because we already looked at the other one. Here, this I ended up folding. It's a call. And we call king queen more than ace queen. Both are indifferent though. Like, what's the ace queen hand that I ended up okay? This makes sense here. We have done more of the middling hands. So stuff like this needs to fold now. Jack 6-3. Yeah, that's a gutter, obviously. Okay, so yeah, okay, cool. Just going to do this somewhat simple and say, because I'm guessing that if we make it a bit more, let's do that. But actually, let's stress test this assumption, right? So what we're saying here is, like, let's say we are on something like this, then we'd fold some of these. And now it's in there sometimes. Yeah. So it has to do with the disconnected nature of this texture. The fact that we don't really have a lot of hands that connect. Like, we have a ton of hands that have to fold already, like 9-10 offsuit, stuff like that. So yeah, cool. That makes sense to me. I know the folding with the king of spades here, which I would never do now. So it's kind of funny that when you're under time pressure and you click quickly, that you sometimes make mistakes like this. Here I ended up calling. So queen jack will definitely defend. And if it's more disconnected, this might defend as well. Yeah, so let's say that this is 5-3. Still folding mostly. Okay. 4 deuce. So removing like more of this, and then like, ooh, we start calling a little bit, but definitely a touch too weak still. How much are we losing? Yeah, so it seems significant enough. So this basically tells me everything I need to know. Like, I would never release this as part of the course, because I could see that, yeah, this needs some more clarification, but for me, this is fine. I ended up calling, so we said Jack 8 is definitely calling. This I'm not too sure about. So, yeah. King 5 is defending, Jack 8 is defending. Let's make this a rainbow texture. It's still falling probably. Oh no, we're calling all of these. That's pretty cool. We're calling the backdoor here on the rainbow texture, but on this one. Yeah. I'm sort of trying to think if this is something that I want to include, or if I'm just going to accept the fact that I'd be making a small mistake here and not care too much. Now it's a gutter, obviously. Okay. Yeah, so it's definitely the fault. Yeah, okay. We need it to be rainbow. We can just say that, right? Like, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if I understand the reason. No. Yeah, we have all these hands that are calling pure, obviously. That is going to have, yeah, okay, so it's basically like that, right? It's actually pretty straightforward. You just have flush draws that are calling pure, so. These ones are not, and then these ones sometimes. So in other words, like, you have these hands that are folding. The hearts are typically defending. Spades are always defending. If we make this rainbow, I'm going way too deep into this right now. I'm just curious to see. So yeah, basically we're just defending pretty much every backdoor. Now, and clubs you're folding. So yeah, like your high card hands are worth a bit more, basically. All right, so let's see. I folded this. I already made a flashcard of a similar hand, so I'm not going to go too deep into this. Here I ended up folding this as a call. It seems like something that I'd call now. Looking at this, since it's disconnected enough, like if this is a 3 and we have deuces, it might be a bit closer. Yeah, so that makes sense to me. We make this more connected, right? So let's say we do Jack 10. Still calling Jack 10 3, and then like 4s. Yeah, okay, I'll do this. Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I would call this, like, I don't know. Here I'm folding, it's a low EV call. It feels like a similar hand as a Jack 5. But it's kind of cuspy, as you can see here. Going with the queen. I sound like a very simple rule of thumb could be, if I'm not sure, just call when we don't have the heart. Which I guess is reasonable. Yeah, okay. And here we ended up calling. This is like just kind of the worst second pair, and we just end up folding it. But like even here, like red, okay, so 9, 10, these ones fold. Okay, so these broke some bluffs, I guess. This one doesn't really, so yeah, we need to just fold these a bit more. I'm just going to take a screenshot here. I think that is close enough to being accurate that we can say, okay, a fold. Okay. Nice. Gunner, I would never fold these days. This is a frequency mistake. Back to straight or plus back to fresh draw. Let's see. Like this is a rainbow texture, so I might just come to the conclusion that I'm folding backdoors so often here. Let's see, unmade hands, and then like if it's spades, hearts. That's actually like if we have 5-3, we're folding. Yeah, okay, well, okay. 6-5, we're folding. Yeah, so this is actually this, because this is a 7. Okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like this kind of a, yeah, okay, that's cool. That's actually a pretty cool one. I'm just going to add that simply because it's a cool one, not because it's a very important one. Something like this. All right, cool. Ace 9, I ended up calling on a pair texture, but it's a fold. But it seems like a spot where mostly we're calling with hands like this. So with the ace of spades, just not with the heart. It's just not with the heart. And this is something that makes sense in practice as well, because pool is going to check us some backdoors, obviously. So, all right. So let's see if there's on, because we're getting into the frequency mistakes now. Yeah. So But we'll leave it at this. Cool. So that's it for this video. If you guys have any questions, hit me up in the chat and talk to you guys soon. Bye.